Welcome to the first episode of the Designgold podcast, where we'll be talking about an assortment of design and technology related topics, hosted by myself, Rehan, and my good friend, Jonathan.
This podcast, I guess, is titled Door Handles. And specifically, we wanted to talk about the Donald Norman doors. So, what we have now known to, or they're known as Norman doors, is basically out of his book, The Design of Everyday Things, that talks about the kind of a cognitive friction or problem that people have with just opening doors sometimes. And the idea was to basically have this as an introduction to user experience. And as many people have done, this was one of my first books that I read about user experience and about affordances and all of these kind of words that are used in the industry to introduce me to what it means to design for the user, to design for the person and the human. So what, I let you kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's Norman doors is sort of an interesting concept where it's, I guess, a little bit of background is sort of this idea of how do you know what's like a right way to use a door? You probably interface with a door where you first push it, but then it says pull, or vice versa, or it doesn't have a label, and you're like, how do you operate this thing, right? And that sort of is the concept behind this coining of the Norman door. If that's accurate, would you want to add anything to that, Jonathan?
No, so that is it. I mean, it just reminds me of when I worked in Silicon Valley. I remember going to another, when you work in a software industry, you probably have several buildings, and each building has different functions, an engineering building or, business marketing building. And my colleague and I went to another building to do some research, and we were familiar with this building. We had been there before, and we had no trouble getting into the reception area. What we had trouble with were the doors going in from the reception area to the actual office, kind of office floor. And we had been there before, and there's basically these door handles, and at the bottom of the door handle there was a kind of label that said, please pull. And my colleague, her being a very seasoned UX researcher, with like an HCI master's degree from a top school, was trying to push the door when it actually said pull. And It was the funniest thing, because she looked at me very seriously and told me, there is something about pull that I don't understand. And I'm like, I knew that she understood the word pull and the way doors worked. I mean, she was able to get it at the third try, but it's just like this complete cognitive dissonance, this kind of slippage. I'm sorry, this kind of friction that happens there. And as a matter of fact, these are what Norman doors are. When you're kind of pulling when you should be pushing, using the wrong burner on the stove, even though you've been using that stove for years. All of these things that don't quite match with the operations that an object should have. And this is what Donald Norman basically lays out in the Design of Everyday Things.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think that's a great example of like this weird case of, we all understand it, but somehow it still doesn't work. Something isn't going the way we expect, and it tends to be sort of the most common of interactions. And whether that, I would say, one sort of modern day Normanian interaction would be like when you scroll, like on a MacBook, right? Now you have what they coined the natural scroll versus the other scroll. I don't remember what they name it, but basically you scroll down to go down, and you scroll down to go up, like a touchscreen, where you scroll down and it sort of is inverted from what you would expect when we only had sort of laptop or sort of mouse input. It was sort of that kind of piece. And I think that's sort of interesting. But I think talking more, going sort of back to hardware, there's this small company, you've probably heard of it, Tesla, They design like a couple cars or something, but every one of their cars, they've decided to reinvent the door handle. I mean, in sort of the same fashion that Don Norman talks about doors, and even there's a great actually Vox video that talks through it, and I think they use an example of office building doors and how people are putting post-its on the door because they're like, I don't know which way this door is supposed to operate. Even actually, I was at one of the buildings here, and the door, it looks like you're supposed to pull it, but it says push on it. And honestly, if I was the one who had to open it, I probably would have pulled it first. But my colleague was the one, so she pushed the door and it was fine. But I wouldn't have necessarily noticed it because I was looking at like some other subtleties of the door, like the frame or this and that, and thinking, oh, maybe I'm supposed to pull this. Or because like we're coming out of the elevator bay, generally, so I guess some fun fact about architecture background, when you have an egress, you have to have the doors most of the time they open into the egress, and that's because if for some reason there was debris that like fell in the way and you couldn't open the door, that's unsafe for the user. So like all these little pieces from my background, I'm thinking, oh, it should be able to pull it because we're standing in the elevator bay, but it wasn't. But yeah, it's sort of interesting. But I think that talks to, I guess, going back to the Tesla doors, they have the Model S, the X, and now the 3. They have 3 distinct door interactions. Wow. And I'm thinking specifically about the handles, but sort of their entire door mechanism are a little bit different. On the S, they have the auto present door handles, where on sort of lock or close of the door, they're flush with the panel. And when you try to open it, they pop out, and then you can grab it and pull it like as you would expect with a traditional car. Then the Model X it doesn't actually have a handle. It only has like a touchpad on the exterior where you click it, and then it just pops the door open. And then the Model 3 has a different contraption, which is, I guess, in line from what I've heard with several luxury sports car makers, where you push half the handle in with half your hand, and then it reveals the rest of it, and then you pull the whole door out. Yeah. So, wow. Anyways, that's sort of an interesting piece, and I think it's just like, why have they decided to go ahead and make 3 distinct doors, sort of knowing their design team probably has some know-how around this concept of a Norman door, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's like an attempt to revolutionize how we open doors, and,
right.
and doing it very differently every single time they build a car. They don't have a continuity to it for their own products.
Yeah, and that reinvention has hurt them, because the Model X was delayed a year because of their Falcon wing doors. You know, those doors that sort of open up.
Right. You know, and this brings up a good point. So within kind of understanding what is user experience as a field, from what I gather, I could say that it is basically studying and designing for a human interaction with an object, whether it's a car or a user interface in a computer. It's just like the study and design for. So the word study basically is associated with research, and that is important.
Right.
Because it informs design, and it's not a breakthrough kind of thought. We've been doing this many times before, but it's important to know that it kind of brings into question companies like Tesla. You know, they're doing the research, or are they doing the research? You know, or are they just coming up with designs because they're a cool company. They build cool cars. And are they just trying to be cool? Or they're just trying to somehow tap into whatever cool is, aesthetics, a different way of doing things,
Right.
without grounding it in some form of research or study about the human body and how we interact with the world around us.
No, for sure. I mean, I think they definitely want to play in that cool space. So in part of it, they threw out logic for it. Just like if you look at I was watching a video earlier today about the Koenigsegg's, those Swedish cars. Their doors are so complicated. I mean, you touch the door, you push it. It's a completely automated system, but instead of it swinging out, it doesn't swing up like you would imagine. It rotates sort of out towards the side view mirror, and it's like, how would anyone expect that interaction?
Jeez.
Or there was another vehicle, some other hypercar, where they have reverse suicide doors.
What?
So they swing up a little bit, or sorry, were they reverse suicide doors? They might have been. There was one with reverse suicide and one with reverse butterfly doors. So the reverse butterfly door is where the hinge is on sort of the back, like where the B pillar is, the sort of between the first and second set of seats, if you had sort of 4 seats. And then it swings out sort of in the back, and then it swings also up. And it's like, what is the purpose of this? Literally for the cool factor, because people are like, wow, I've never seen this. I want one. But like, do I need this? And now I need a manual to open my door. Like,
yeah, I mean, I wonder if to us, or it's like ridiculous because we're used to like really low end. At least I'm used to really low end cars. Just a Honda being able to like open the door. How most Hondas or most cars are basically designed.
right.
But then the ultra rich or the people that could actually afford these other cars are in a different world. And how is it that they're able to figure this out? What do they really think about their car if they use it every day, or it's actually a nuisance? I mean, it's maybe I don't know if it's a different kind of experience for them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think at that point, when you're playing with cars that are like in the plus $1 million range, you're not buying them as a transportation. You're buying them as a showpiece and an entertainment, right? I mean, you don't go to the track because that's your profession, unless you're like Formula One racer, right? But then you have a team that manages your car and sort of all the technology, and your profession is make sure the thing gets there the first, right? So
yes, yeah, that brings up a good point. I mean, who are we designing for? Who are we designing with? And if the products that we work on are meant for your quote unquote everyday people, then you definitely don't want to keep surprising them with the way that they can get out of or into their own car or their own place.
Yeah. I mean, could you imagine if they had actually like how restaurants have those double swing doors? Can you imagine if a car door had a like try swing door, and depending on the day, it decided which way you had to open it? People would be so frustrated. Sometimes it swings up, sometimes it swings to the back, sometimes it swings forward, like you would expect.
But would they pay extra for that?
I mean, maybe for the
or
novelty.
Who would pay extra for that?
Or maybe that's like the sort of adware of a car. You don't like this feature, you have to pay to get rid of it.
That's the future. You have to pay for good UX. Like we will intentionally make it really difficult for you to use this product unless you pay for us to remove each layer of difficulty.
Right. It's like a dystopiatic UX world. You have to pay for better UX, but not in the traditional sense. It actually like harms your experience, not just improves it. Like on the spectrum. That's kind of interesting.
We're not too far from that world. It seems that we are actually paying for that in many of the products. But also another point that I was thinking about is that for the everyday people, for the everyday objects that you want to use, such as your stove and your car and being able to get in and out of your workplace or house, the objects that make it difficult, or the functions or functionality that make it difficult, make you feel like there is something wrong with you, kind of like with the story that I started off with my colleague not understanding what pull meant. She looked at me because he said, is it me? Am I going and saying that I don't know how to open doors or understand what pulling means? It's and it's actually interesting because that is what chapter 1 in the design of everyday things is about. Chapter 1, I think I have it in my notes here. It's called like the psychology of everyday things. I'm sorry, the psychopathology of everyday things.
Oh, okay.
In psychopathology being the study of like mental disorders, like making you feel like you're insane, you're not being able to operate a door or something like that. And so kind of you start blaming yourself. And our stove at some point makes us feel stupid for not remembering which kind of burner to turn on, because of the front of the stove is basically a line of knobs.
Right.
And and the only difference is that maybe there's a little drawing on it, but it's small.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even aligned or in some form of position to reflect how the burner is physically on top of the stoves or the burners, right? It's just basically aligned. So you have to remember that mapping doesn't is not laid out in the actual design of the stove. And so it makes you feel like either you've been using that stove for years. It happens to me, and you makes you feel stupid, makes you feel insane sometimes. But then when you understand that it's actually poor design, or it's actually something that was produced without that kind of thought, then you begin to explore into kind of like the world of user experience design, right? Knowing that things should afford the function that you want out of them.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's true, right? There's this sort of interesting dichotomy between how much is it user learning and how much is it poor design. But I think you notice it the strongest in products and sort of design elements that are bifurcated by like 2 or 3, like microwaves, doors. You mentioned the stove, where there's basically 2 standards. And if there's only a handful of standards, you get used to using one, because there is something to get used to, where maybe interacting with the website, there isn't as much standard because it's cheaper to sort of make so much variety. So you don't get used to it. You learn it sort of on use. So then it doesn't bother you. But when there's only a few options, then it sort of gets weird, because you think it's going into memory, but then it comes right back out, and you got to retrain it.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of interesting. I mean, it sort of talks a little bit to even some web conventions that were familiar, like the hamburger icon or something like that. Like this menu, where did it come from? I don't know. Somebody just one day said, let's put things in a menu, and then everybody followed suit, and then they realized, hey, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. But the group that sort of said, hey, this is not a great idea, maybe people who use their site said, hey, is it me or is it the site? Because they were so used to the other variant at this point. I don't know. We'll have to ask some of those people.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can kind of see this this world maybe, and I don't know the entire history of HCI. I should probably read that, but
just read the whole history, no problem. Weekend, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's literature out there that kind of give you a brief summary of how human-computer interaction has kind of evolved and where it comes from. Some of the beginnings of what user experience is and software design was born out of psychology and cognitive psychology, or cognitive science even, to basically situate these kind of design problems within a particular, within the individual, right? And to analyze how they think about operating the world around them
Right.
or kind of just being in performance within the world around them, right? And this is very much this very much led to the usability studies, right? To have somebody in a lab use a product or a software product, and kind of observing how they use them,
Right.
putting them in kind of like a scenario or situation where they would have to complete a series of tasks while there is a researcher, a moderator, basically guiding them through the, or not guiding them through, but asking them the questions and as he or she observes them. And so this is actually the kind of setting where I used to work. This would be a usability lab. It's basically comprised by 2 rooms divided by a one-way mirror. You kind of feel a little bit like a lab rat being observed on the other side, or basically the other side had other researchers or maybe even like just generally stakeholders. Could be from marketing, could be from executives, kind of observing how users, how real people would basically operate their products or their software.
Right.
And so it's kind of a contrived, not so much a real world example or real world observation. You bring them in, it's a lab, and then you ask them questions. It's not like you're observing them in their natural kind of environment, whatever that
Right.
is.
Right. No, I think so. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I guess I'm just kind of going over this to kind of say it's a very kind of psychological experiment to do this, and this is where things kind of come out. Later on, kind of like the field, the design field, the user experience field, started questioning those kind of methods and said, well, why can't we observe people in their natural place where they use these products? And so then you have what they call contextual inquiries to basically do research in their context, in their office environment. If they're using, for example, Microsoft Word, and we want to observe how they use Microsoft Word. And then beyond that, which is more costly because it's a variation of an anthropological ethnography, basically. It's an observation or a longer observation of somebody using a product, and what's beyond a product. Not only just them using the product, what do they do around the product? What are other activities or influence? So making all of these other connections that kind of came out of anthropological traditions.
Right.
And then there's other fields. Now it's a very much an interdisciplinary field. They want people to, in the design and especially in the user researcher roles, to have a kind of a broader kind of background. They could come from any of the social sciences, sometimes in the humanities. You have this kind of rising, for example, discipline called digital humanities. And that is very much in line with user experience research.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. It's sort of this. Yes, it's sort of, you may not see as an end user, as somebody who uses these products, sort of all the pieces that went into it. Yes, it's a cool looking, pretty thing, but more than likely there was a handful of folks, whether that's that team who designed that product or somebody else, where they like researched from literature saying, hey, this is probably a good way to go about doing this interaction, whether that's opening a door or clicking on the mouse or whatever, and then building off of that and realizing there's so many players involved, and most of it comes down to understanding people at the end of the day, right? I mean, we all design things, I guess, unless you're designing dog toys, but even then you're still designing it for the person to buy it. Like, you have to design it for the owner. So even then you're still designing it for sort of the owner and people. So it's understanding and designing and working around sort of people in one way, shape, or form, and that's sort of the beauty that this industry works in, and sort of that blurriness that some people don't enjoy. But I think that's the interdisciplinary nature of it. But
yeah, exactly. It's not like I mean, they call a lot of things science, but even that is questionable. What they mean by that, it's not a mathematical certainty that if you observe this, you will get this result, and therefore you can provide this design that it will be innovative or will do X. I mean, it is very much, we're dealing with the complexity of human nature. Sometimes, as they tell you, right, when you're kind of learning about research, that subjects, participants, or people don't always do what they say they do. They completely will do something different, and unintentionally and intentionally sometimes, right?
Right.
So that kind of observation, whether it's in the lab or outside, the plain fact that you're observing may actually change their behavior.
Right.
And so it's not an exact science. We're trying to figure this out as we go along. But as you point out, I think that the bottom line to it is that it is a kind of a, I want to say human-centered kind of process and design, but it can be, dog-centered. It could be even object-centered. Whatever you're designing for.
User first.
Yeah, exactly. And what it, and there is even just a slight difference that I want to kind of make between designing for and designing with.
Yep.
The designing for someone else or something else is not the same as designing with them. There's participatory design where you involve the actual users or people that are going to use the product, and you have their direct say into how they want it. You have them participate in almost a decision-making design process, as opposed to just observing them like lab rats and then designing on what you think, how you interpret their behavior.
Right. It's like playing a really bad game of telephone versus just asking the guy who's whispering into your what they actually said.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, and I mean there is. I guess also, I don't know if this is related to this or is in another podcast, but I wanted to kind of quickly go over the difference between kind of what a designer, even graphic designer, is, and I don't even know what the title would be for a person that designs with a little bit more depth of this kind of of this interdisciplinary understanding. What I mean by that is that, like, design, as a designer, you get a lot of prestige nowadays. And I don't know if it's always been like this, but within at least the software industry, a designer has a lot of prestige. And they're kind of looked at as having this intuition for what good design is and what bad design is, even in graphic design. And you probably can talk more about this, but the only kind of things I wanted to point out was that this is almost arbitrary. If we don't understand the human condition, the ecology in which we're designing for, I think, in my experience, that you miss out on a lot, and it just becomes kind of sometimes a guessing game or introducing your own biases into a product, into how you see the world. And even if you take in some data from the field, from field research as a designer, because this is like the division of expertise, right? You most likely, if you're designing, you don't get to be the researcher, although there's definitely a lot of people that do that. But you're taking this information, and I think it relates to the phone thing, right? So the information was interpreted by researchers, who then give it to you, and you reinterpret that information.
Right.
And every time you interpret something, you're basically introducing your own take, your own vision, your own biases into it. And then you produce a representation, your kind of vision, or your representation of what you think the users want, need, or how they behave, and how they should use your product, or how they're going to use your product. And if you don't have, if you don't even, if you don't realize this as being kind of this kind of notion that you're reinterpreting reinterpretations and designing for something, then there's a problem with that. Let alone the designers that just say, oh, I know what the users want. I don't even need to look at the data. This is good design. And if they can't use this, then they're losers. So, I mean, I have quite a bit more to say about that, and to kind of ground it on some literature that I've been actually doing lately. There is a book. It was published in 2006, but it's basically design studies by, I guess the main editor is Audrey Bennett, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. And others. There's definitely a lot of chapters in there by others, and they kind of basically the book promotes alternative to the approach to graphic design, and so I think it could fit with graphic design or design in general,
right?
And it does that by looking at research-based graphic design theory. Which is basically what I'm kind of saying here, that design should involve kind of observation and interdisciplinary work of you being in some form connected with the people that you're designing for, but also realizing that you're interpreting that
right
with your own biases and are complicit in the way that the product turns out and the implications that it has on individuals and society. And I think that these are important things.
No, I mean, totally. I think that's honestly a good place to end this, but sort of thinking about what we can ask sort of folks what their definition is, or what they think a designer is, and sort of think about these statements that you've proposed, and we'll continue this as time goes on, and see how the role of a designer changes through our discussions. I think that's a good place to end for this episode.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Design Gold. To learn more about the show, follow us online at Designgold.xyz.